Good evening and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. It is so lovely to have all of you here tonight. Thank you when you were given the option to Zoom, to those of you who came live for coming live anyway for tonight's program. We've been fielding calls all week over the last several weeks of people begging for a seat. So thank you for coming. Thank you for the 60 or so individuals who have shown up on Zoom. We're delighted to have you here too for tonight's program. I'm Beth Hessel. I'm the Executive Director of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. And how many of you are members of the Athenaeum? Welcome. If you did not raise your hand, I hope you saw someone near you who is a member. So after the program, you can ask them a little bit more about what the Athenaeum is. I hope you will consider making us your home library, your home community for learning, for lectures, for small groups, for knitting circle, for French or Spanish conversation groups, whatever it is you're looking for, a place to write. If you have students in your life, for a place for them to come and study. We are a lively, vibrant, local community library, membership supported. So we welcome all of you. I have to say we have enjoyed being a part of the Society Hill Civic Association for many years, and appreciative of Susan's leadership of Society Hill Civic Association and all that you do, and delighted to have the opportunity to provide this space for your general membership meeting this evening. So right now, I invite you all to join me in welcoming Susan Collins of the Society Hill Civic Association to the Athenaeum this evening.
Everybody, thank you so much. And really, the only reason I'm here is because I met somebody in a coffee shop at Gem Coffee Shop at 17th and Pine, which is his smaller shop. His stuff is amazing, and he's French. And I met a gentleman there, and we got talking about what he was working on. And he told me about his friend François, who was from Hopkins. I had gone to Hopkins. My daughters went to Hopkins. I was like, oh, tell me. And so he told me about the book he was writing that François had written about when Americans spoke French, and that it all took place in Society Hill, that there were all these French people who came here and found Philadelphia apparently a welcoming place. And so I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful, as running Society Hill Civic and focusing, yes, on our history and on who we are today, I reached out and was shocked when he said he would come and speak with us. So, and I must recommend his book, Current Times Being As They Are, and the news being what it is. I must say I have been rather down. And what I've been doing is I've been reading his book, and I'm transported to another place, which is Philadelphia in 1790s. And it is a wonderful place. And it really is neat because you can sort of walk around and see where the Bingham Mansion was and where Talleyrand lived, and imagine it. And you can be taken away from our current state of affairs. So with nothing further, Professor, if you would please entertain.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for that really delightful introduction. And I'm so happy to be here. And I want to thank Beth as well, who's been a wonderful host. There you are. And who's told me a lot about. I've learned a lot about the Athenaeum while I've been here. So I'm really just couldn't be happier to be here. And it's nice to be back in Philadelphia. I certainly spent a lot of time here while I was doing the research for the book. I did a lot of work at the Library Company, at the Historical Society, at the American Philosophical Society, and I'm now realizing it was a big mistake to not have consulted the Athenaeum more. It's fun to talk in Philadelphia because there's such an intense sense of civic memory and civic pride. It's in that regard kind of unlike any other city that I know. Maybe New Orleans can compete, but it's always great to speak to people from Philadelphia, and particularly people from Society Hill, which really, as Susan was mentioning, plays a big part in my book. The book is actually 10 years old. It's odd for me to think about that. It still feels in certain ways kind of fresh as something that I was working on. And it looks at some what I always thought about as a kind of hidden history. The title is meant to be provocative. The United States didn't really speak French. It's metaphorical. You know, the United States, I think, as I'll talk about tonight, was really very tilted towards France in this very brief period in ways that are easily forgotten, particularly since French and U.S. relations are often so tense. I tend to think that it's, you know, two countries divided by shared values. And so it's easy to forget that relations weren't always this way. France was the United States' first and its greatest ally. Its intervention in the American Revolution had secured American independence. The French knew this. The Americans certainly remembered this, and they were enormously grateful in these decades following the Revolution. When the French Revolution broke out, Americans could hardly have been more excited. Europe's most powerful monarchy had suddenly fallen to its knees. It was thrilling. In 1792, France became a republic. Excitement in the United States reached a frenzy. Everywhere there were parades, celebrations, huge gatherings with thousands of people marching in the streets and singing French songs. Then in January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed. Aristocrats began to be massacred in the streets of Paris, and thousands of people fled, including some of them to the United States. And my book followed 5 of the refugees who'd come to the United States. I'd run across these figures before in previous reading. These were very famous, eminent figures in French history, famous aristocrats who were hanging out in Philadelphia with Americans like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or Alexander Hamilton. They'd been centrally involved in the French Revolution. And here they were in a small neighborhood in Philadelphia, living in the capital and wandering around seemingly aimlessly through the backcountry. They seemed completely out of place. It was almost as though they'd forgotten that they, you know, belonged in French history, and they'd sort of stumbled into American history for this brief moment. And so I wanted to use their adventures as a way to look at Franco-American relationship in new way. It was going, as I originally began thinking about it, it was going to be a story that was based in the revolutionary capitals of Paris and Philadelphia, and it was going to think about these revolutionary connections. These are old and venerable questions in American history or in transatlantic history. But actually, as I began doing the research, it took me, as often happens, of course, it took me in different directions. What I first imagined as a small book got much bigger, as I was reminded today as I was lugging these books from Baltimore. Quite big indeed. It pulled me beyond Paris and Philadelphia, took me through London, into the Caribbean, and deep into the continental interior. It expanded beyond the 5 French aristocrats to include bankers in Amsterdam, slaves in Haiti, aristocrats in London, indigenous peoples in the Ohio Valley, backcountry settlers in Kentucky, and many more. All of them, it turned out, were inseparable from the stories of my 5 French aristocrats. And I won't be able to cover all this tonight, but I'll try to give you a little bit of a glimpse of some of the things that I looked at. So let's start first with the 5 French aristocrats. The first, and certainly the most famous today, is Talleyrand. He was a former French archbishop who sat in the Constituent Assembly that proposed the nationalization, and he proposed the nationalization of church lands. He would go on to become France's longest serving and most famous foreign minister, and would do so much to reshape the map of Europe, the one that still in many ways exists today. He was the wittiest character. He was the most observant. He was always ready with a terrific quip, and in many ways, he was the most useful figure for me. And I felt as I was writing this book that I had to resist his sort of gravitational pull, this urge to sort of make him my main character. The second character was Louis-Marie, the Vicomte de Noailles. Like his brother-in-law, the Marquis de Lafayette, Noailles had fought in the American Revolution. He'd represented France at the negotiations for Cornwallis's surrender. He was brave, he was dashing, he was a knowledgeable soldier and said to be one of the finest dancers in Versailles. He was a frequent dance partner, allegedly, of Marie Antoinette. A few years later, when he was a few years later, back when he was in France after the American Revolution, it was he who'd presided over the Constituent Assembly on the historic night of August 4th, 1789, when feudalism was formally abolished. There was the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt, who was one of the wealthiest aristocrats in old regime France. He'd served as master of the king's wardrobe. So these weren't, your sort of garden variety aristocrats, if one can put it that way. They were quite the opposite. People like Talleyrand, Noailles, Liancourt, they descended from France's oldest and noblest families. As master of the king's wardrobe, it was Liancourt who famously burst into the king's bedchambers on the night of July 14, 1789, to tell him about the uprising in Paris. Is it a revolt? The king asked. Non, sire, c'est une révolution, Liancourt replied. By the time he'd arrived in the United States, he'd lost his entire fortune and seen his cousin executed. He was brooding. He was depressed. He was the most introspective of the lot. And there's a wonderful diary that he kept while he was here, which reflects this kind of moodiness. One can imagine him wandering the dark streets of Philadelphia. Then there was the Comte de Volnay, a traveler and philosopher, famous writer, future senator of France. He was probably the deepest thinker. He was certainly the most scholarly. He would go on to become a renowned scholar of the Orient and of the ancient world. And finally, was Moreau de Saint-Méry, a lawyer and a historian. He'd been born in the Caribbean. He married into a wealthy planter family and had gone to Paris to write about the Caribbean and to enter French politics. I grew, I think, most attached to him in certain ways. He wore his insecurities on his sleeve. He was always trying to prove himself fit for the eminent company that he kept. And there's actually a new book on Moreau's intellectual world that's come out recently. I haven't read it yet, by Sarah Johnson. And I have memories. This tells you the sort of time frame of doing this kind of scholarship. But I have memories of the two of us one summer walking the streets of Society Hill and other neighborhoods, and what would have been the waterfront at the time, to try to reconstruct what Philadelphia would have been like. So these were all eminent figures, as I've said. They were leaders of the early stages of the French Revolution. They admired the new United States and its constitution, and they hoped to implement a constitutional monarchy in France. All five of them sat in the Constituent Assembly, which produced the first constitution in French history, and had events taken a different course, they would today be considered among the French Republic's founding fathers. But of course, that wasn't the path that history took. Only 2 years after their constitution was written, the monarchy was overthrown, the king was executed, and the liberals, these liberal aristocrats, fled. Many of them went to England, but when war broke out between France and Britain, they were forced to leave again, and they were chased across the Atlantic all the way here to Philadelphia. So let me back up. I'll take a pause here and back up for a moment. I want to sort of expand our focus, to broaden the scale away from the city of Philadelphia, away from the scale of individual lives. One of the things I try to do in this book is to play a little bit with scale, try to think about very micro spaces and try to think about very macro spaces. The emigres came at a time when the United States was really nothing like the power it is today. It takes, I think, a leap of imagination to picture the country as it was at the time. It was weak, it was fragile, a collection of 13 states huddled along the Atlantic coast, riven by divisions, continually under siege by native and foreign powers. Today, of course, the United States is a continental, even a global power. Back then, its sovereignty extended from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachian Mountains, with a few fingers jutting into Kentucky and Tennessee. The heart of the Atlantic economy lay to the south. It lay in the Caribbean. And here's one of the major lessons that I learned while doing this research. The Caribbean, not the United States, not the mainland, was really Europe's main interest in the Americas. These islands, which produced sugar, coffee, indigo, the commodities that powered the Atlantic economy. Protecting those Caribbean islands was a major reason France had intervened in the American Revolution. In fact, I would argue that it was the major reason France intervened in the American Revolution. So we have to think our we have to sort of flip the current power dynamics, the kind of the US as the center of global finance and diplomacy. The Caribbean was where the action was. This is where the economic action was. The US was the kind of hinterland. And it really is hard to exaggerate the importance of these Caribbean islands to Europe in general and to France in particular. Many historians argue that they produced the wealth that led to Europe's industrial takeoff in the 19th century, that led ultimately to Europe's global preeminence. French intervention in the American Revolution wasn't just about getting revenge against Britain for its loss in the 7 Years' War. It wasn't just about dismantling the empire of its great foe, Britain. Most fundamentally, France wanted to protect its economic and its strategic interests in the Caribbean. American harbors would provide bases for French naval operations in the Caribbean. American resources like lumber and wheat would supply the French sugar colonies as they had previously supplied the British. France would, by allying with the United States, French policymakers thought that they could secure all the benefits of empire without its costs. But the French Revolution quickly spilled over into the Caribbean. In 1791, an insurrection broke out in Saint-Domingue in today's Haiti. Slaves in the northern plains began a rebellion that soon turned into a revolution against the institution of slavery itself, the institution that produced all this wealth for Europe. Under the extraordinary leadership of Toussaint Louverture, Haitian forces fought off French planters, invading Spanish forces, and the British Navy, all three of the greatest powers of the age. The Haitian Revolution would upend the Atlantic economy and the labor regime on which it depended. And it would bring tens of thousands of French-speaking refugees pouring into the United States. And so it was in the midst of all this ferment, all this political ferment, all this economic, this social movement, this migration, that my French refugees arrived in the United States, and all of them settled in Philadelphia. Well, why did they come to Philadelphia? It's a question one might reasonably ask. Probably in this room, nobody asked that. Of course they came to Philadelphia. Where else would they go? It was the country's principal port. It exported wheat, lumber, and other goods from the Delaware Valley, which was already known as North America's breadbasket, shipping them out to the Caribbean, across the Atlantic to Europe. It was the country's primary entrepot. It imported sugar, coffee, indigo, all those commodities that I was talking about from the Caribbean, came in to Philadelphia and then were reshipped out to Europe and other parts of the world. They had even established trading links to Asia. Philadelphia merchants had even established trading links to Asia with French ports as far away as Pondicherry. Luxury goods were pouring into the United States from France and from the French Atlantic world at this point. It had become the country's consumption capital. Philadelphia was the city's financial capital, where the first bank of the United States had been founded just a few blocks away from here on 3rd Street. I'm actually quite proud of these before and after shots. I spent a lot of time fooling around with these. It was the city's cultural capital. And it was the site of the Library Company, which had been founded by Benjamin Franklin. Today, this building, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, houses the American Philosophical Society, which was an organization that already existed at the time and which inducted several of the emigres who I followed. And I've just learned tonight that building also at one point housed the Athenaeum. And of course, Philadelphia was the nation's political capital. Here's Congress Hall, where Congress sat in the 1790s when all of these events were taking place. The House of Representatives was downstairs, the Senate was upstairs, and you can still see a portrait of King Louis XVI just off the Senate chamber. I think it's a replica. Someone maybe can confirm that. I'm not sure either. The same portrait hung in the Senate in the 1790s, even interestingly after the king's execution. I hope you appreciate the photograph I took here. I was almost arrested by a security guard trying to get this one. I think it's. So Philadelphia at the time was a notwithstanding these photos here, we're drawing continuity. It was a very different city at the time. It had a population of about 40,000 people. So 40,000 is not very big. It's about the size of a large American university. It wouldn't make it into the top 10 of large American universities. There are fewer. The population was smaller than the number of students at Penn State's State College campus, and it was tiny. Virtually the entire population was huddled along the banks of the Delaware River. You get a sense of here of the this is the settled part of Philadelphia, where where we are now. It only stretches a few blocks this way. This was a farmland, it was not laid out yet. And so the settled part of Philadelphia really was stretched north and south along the Delaware River, just a few blocks in. This is the Philadelphia that we're talking about. And in geographic terms, it's smaller than a college campus, smaller than the campus at State College. And it was incredibly dense. It had a density of about 17,000 people per square kilometer. So to give you a sense, that's far more densely populated than Philadelphia today is, far more densely populated than Manhattan even. To find a population density on par with this, you have to look to Mumbai, to Bombay. Thousands of French people poured into this mix. It was always hard for me to figure out exactly what the numbers were. On the low end, the estimates are around 3,000 French people who came as refugees, French-speaking people who came as refugees to Philadelphia. On the high end, the estimates range to about 8,000. So that's anywhere from about 8 to 20% of the city, which would have been French-speaking at the time. And this is really, as I'm sort of intimating, this is a face-to-face city. You think about 40,000 people crammed together on an area smaller than the college campus. You can walk the city, you recognize faces as you walk around. So the sudden arrival of 3,000 or between 3,000 and 8,000 people is a French-speaking people is a significant event, and it would transform the city, and eventually it would transform the country. With these waves of refugees pouring into the city, Philadelphia was reshaped. French wine and silk and mustard arrived from distant ports. Merchants built grand houses in French neoclassical style, filled them with refined French furniture, ornate French tapestries, and exquisite Gobelin porcelain. The aroma of French food wafted through the alleys behind South 2nd Street, including the delicacies prepared by Marino, a pastry chef who'd once worked for the French court at Versailles. French revolutionary songs performed nightly in the Chestnut Street Theater echoed off the city's cobblestones. Madame Mercier, who had studied with Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, opened a shop catering to Philadelphia's transnational clientele. French silversmiths, French dentists, French dance instructors all sold their services. French language rang out on Philadelphia's streets and in its most refined social spaces. French newspapers, French bookstores, French taverns all shaped the city's cosmopolitan public sphere. And so it did seem for a few years anyway, as though the United States capital spoke French. The French refugees concentrated primarily in two sections. It's sort of amusing to see this map now. This took many hours of labor pouring through city directories and other kinds of tax records and other things. I had a little team of research assistants who helped me with this, and we were able to identify hundreds and hundreds of French people. They concentrated primarily in two sections. The densest concentration of French speakers was in the north part of the city, above Market Street. French boarding houses, bathhouses, more artisanal shops, that demanded less skilled work than the silversmiths or the dentists who I was talking about a moment ago. Even back then, these areas around Vine and Cherry were much more working class. Don't know what they are today, but everything's probably gentrified. But it was that working class character of North Philadelphia would endure. It's where W.C. Fields grew up, of course, and got his Philadelphia associations. I have to quote him. I once spent a year in Philadelphia. I think it was on Sunday. Am I allowed to say that here? People are going to start throwing tomatoes. The first prize is a week in Philadelphia. Second prize was 2 weeks. All right. So this wasn't the Philadelphia. This was not the Philadelphia of my characters. They were my folks were aristocrats. They were noble. They were wealthy, or at least they had been wealthy. And so, of course, there was only one place they could go. It was above Dock Street, which had recently been covered over, from between Chestnut to Spruce, between Front and 4th Streets. And I'm talking, of course, about this area down here, about Society Hill. In the heart of Society Hill, and I've labeled where these figures actually lived. Moreau had a bookstore. In the heart of Society Hill, in this very small neighborhood, my 5 emigres lived together. They ate together. They socialized together. They forged the most intimate of connections. Every day that he was in Philadelphia, according to Moreau, Talleyrand would drop by in the evening. We opened our hearts to one another. We poured out our feelings, and each of us knew the other's most intimate thoughts. Talleyrand ate nearly every day at a Franco-Dutch banker's house in Society Hill, most likely because the banker employed a French chef. The United States are a country where if there are 32 religions, there's only one dish, Talleyrand commented. And it's a bad one, he added. It always reminded me of that quote, from de Gaulle about France is, how do you govern a country of 500 cheeses? During my research, I came to realize that the 1780s and the 1790s, this period between the American Revolution and the diplomatic collapse of the 1790s, so this 15-year period roughly, it's a largely forgotten moment when the United States was most turned towards France. Many of the greatest merchants in Philadelphia had grown fabulously rich off trade with France and the French Caribbean. Historians refer to this period as the age of the Republican court, which orbited around George Washington's administration. And I tried in my research, as I said, I was sort of playing around with different sort of scales, spatial scales, and I tried to get inside the homes where these emigres would have lived to explore the look and the feel of the spaces where they were socializing. The center of Philadelphia's social life in the 1790s is pictured here. It's the home of Anne and William Bingham. This was their grand mansion. It was the largest mansion in Philadelphia in the 1790s. It was modeled on the Duke of Manchester's house in London. When the Binghams had visited London in the 1780s, they decided they would build a replica, really an exact replica of that house in Philadelphia. And you get a sense, this is the closest image that I could find. This dates from the 1830s, and this portico was added later. It was added, I think, in the 1830s. And so you can imagine what it would have looked like before, and it really is identical to the Bingham's house. That building still stands in London. Unfortunately, the Bingham's house burned down in the 1830s, 1840s. But the model on which it was designed still stands in London, and some of you have probably been there. If you've ever visited the Wallace collection in London, you've been inside the Duke of Manchester's mansion. We know a lot about the Bingham house from contemporary descriptions. Few people who visited this house failed to write about it or to talk about it, to describe it really in very vivid detail. The building doesn't exist any longer, but to try to understand what it would have been like, I did the next best thing that I could. I went to London to visit the model, to walk around the interior, and to compare it with the contemporary descriptions in order to get a sense of how the spaces would have felt, the spaces inside the Bingham house would have felt and looked in the 1790s when my emigres arrived. So this is the Bingham home, if you'll imagine it a little bit. And I'll quote from contemporary descriptions of the house as we walk through it. And some of you are presumably some architecture fans. This is the specialty of the Athenaeum. A staircase of Italian marble, wide enough for plants and flowers on either side, curved up from the vestibule on the ground floor to the upstairs rooms, into saloons, as one visitor described it, decorated with Gobelin tapestry and reflecting mirrors. When the Binghams returned from their travels abroad in the early 1780s, they brought from Europe, according to one of their acquaintances, everything for the house and table which the taste and luxury of the times has invented. The Binghams were William Bingham was so proud of the spaces that he'd created, he had himself painted right inside his mansion, next to all the columns and marble in his home. As in the British model, the Binghams added all the neoclassical touches that were so fashionable in Europe at the time, that were made popular by the Scottish architect Robert Adam. And they decorated the house lavishly. Downstairs was the dining room, papered in the French taste, according to one visitor. They brought mirrors, armchairs, fashionable sedan chairs in the form of a lyre. In France, they bought carpets, textiles, Gobelin tapestry to drape their sofa, a 350-piece set of Sèvres china, 200 pieces of tableware, 206 drinking glasses. The furniture, according to another guest, was elegant and even superb. The rooms upstairs were adorned with painted ceilings, with brilliant silk curtains, French arabesque wallpaper by the famous Jean-Baptiste Réveillon in bright red, blue, yellow, greens. In the 18th century, they loved bright colors. Sometimes we walk into these old houses and it's all faded, but we don't get a sense of what it looked like at the time. Bingham had made his money off trade between the Caribbean and Philadelphia, mostly the French islands, Martinique and Philadelphia. and Europe. So when we look at these pictures, when we see these spaces, we see the wealth that Caribbean trade produced. This is the capital that it generated. This is why the Caribbean was so important to Europe and the United States in this period. It was in these spaces that Philadelphia's French-oriented elite socialized and politicked, and it was in these spaces that my French emigres integrated themselves into American life. Talleyrand spent lots of time in the Bingham's house. Noailles even lived in a set of apartments attached to their house. Volney gave French lessons to the Bingham girls. Soon the emigres were incorporated into the country's most elite social networks. For Philadelphians, these figures were a real prize. These Frenchmen who were as conversant with the norms of the Versailles court life as they were with the sparkling conversations in Paris's most legendary salons. They were poised to enchant Philadelphia's elites, to connect these provincial salons and teas to the glitter of the European aristocracy. And this, for me, was one of the great paradoxes of this period. The French revolutionaries in 1789 and 1790, they'd sought to emulate men like Washington and Jefferson and Franklin, these noble, virtuous figures who'd led a revolution, drafted a successful constitution. And yet, when they came to Philadelphia after failing at that effort, they arrived in a city where Philadelphians, these virtuous Quaker figures of French mythology, were busy trying to replicate the manners of the French aristocracy at Versailles. The émigrés were immediately bombarded with invitations to suppers, dinners, balls, any social event where they could spice up an evening. A dense web of networks soon knit the émigrés into American life. And the more I looked at these connections, at these networks, the more interested I became in how they function. Now, we're in the age of the social network, and scholars are not exempt from these kinds of trends. Everyone kind of is, has been rushing in to understand how social networks shaped the age. And so I came up with this image in my book. It's a little convoluted, but the idea was to attempt, anyway, an illustration of how these social networks integrated the French émigrés into Philadelphia's elite life and ultimately American economic networks. These networks were forged by various elements. One was letters of introduction, which is really just a fascinating genre, and I write about these letters in the book. I could talk for a while about them until everybody fell asleep. Friendship and business partnership. This was another bond connecting these French émigrés to American elites. Marriage and kinship, of course, these were one of the most important links in these transatlantic networks. One of Talleyrand's companions married into the family of Henry Knox, who was then the Secretary of War. Another of his traveling companions married into the wealthiest merchant family in Philadelphia. There are lots of stories that I discuss in the book about how these economic networks, which I sort of uncovered through the relationships between these émigrés and their Philadelphia hosts, and how they stretched into Europe. And on one end, into the financial capitals of Europe on one end, and into the backcountry on the other, how you can kind of extend these over and over again. And I think the story that for me best illustrates how these networks overlap with each other, how a friendship could become a kinship, could become a financial partnership, and tie all these people together. The story that to me best illustrates this is the story about a young banker named Pierre César Labouchere. Now, Labouchere is an unknown figure today. He was a descendant of Huguenot. He was a Huguenot who grew up in Nantes, and actually there's interesting Huguenot connections in the back and sort of looming in the background in a lot of this. He grew up in Nantes, and he was sent to Amsterdam to work with another Huguenot family that had emigrated, settled in Amsterdam, and that had become one of the major merchant houses, one of the major banking houses in Amsterdam at the period. It was the Hopes, the Hope family, the Hope Bank. And so Pierre César was sent to become a clerk and learn the business of the banking business in Amsterdam. And he worked as a clerk. And this was a period when Amsterdam, which was the old kind of declining financial capital in Europe, was making more and more connections with London, which was the rising financial capital in Europe at this period. And the Hopes were trying to make more connections, establish better partnerships with British banking houses. And so they sent Pierre César, this clerk, to go work in the Baring Bank in London, an up-and-coming bank at the time. And while he was there, Pierre César met and began courting the daughter of Sir Francis Baring. And evidently things were going very well between them, because one day he knocked on the door of the Francis Baring's office, the head of the bank, and he said, my name is Pierre César Labouchere, and I'd like to marry your daughter. And Sir Francis Baring said, you can't marry my daughter. You're just a clerk in the Hope Bank. And Pierre César said, well, would it change your mind if you knew that I was a partner in the Hope Bank? And Francis Baring said, well, yeah, in that case, I guess it would change my mind. And so with that, he rushed back to Amsterdam and he went and knocked on the door of the Hopes. And he said to them, I want to be a partner. And they said, you can't be a partner. You're just a clerk in our bank. And he said, well, would it change your mind if you knew I was about to marry Sir Francis Baring's daughter? And astonishingly, this worked. He became a partner, and he became son-in-law to Sir Francis Baring, and eventually became an important banker in his own right, we'll run into him briefly at the end. So as the Labouchere story suggests, these networks had major economic implications. They would shape the émigrés' experiences in the United States. Through these networks, the émigrés turned their attention to investments in land. And this was really the least expected for me part of the research that I was doing. I never expected to get interested in land and land speculation, but the 1790s, it turns out, were a time of frenzied and even reckless land speculation. And the émigrés launched themselves into it headfirst. Their connection with wealthy European financial houses like the Hopes made them ideally positioned to channel capital into the United States. Talleyrand was surely the most active speculator of the group, but all the others followed Talleyrand. And gradually, I came to see their investments as the advanced guard of a great incursion into the American backcountry, a flow of European capital deep into the continental interior. That European capital would transform the American West at the time. This is the West that we're looking at. It built settlements. That capital carved roads. It built flour and lumber mills. It extended scarce credit to settlers who needed nothing more than credit. From the broadest perspective, the émigrés' investments in American land helped show how European capital transformed the United States in the late 18th century. Their travels through the backcountry eventually enmeshed the émigrés in delicate geopolitical issues. As they traveled west, they entered into a Franco-Indian world that had existed for more than 200 years, a world of French settlers who'd married with indigenous peoples, forming extensive and highly connected Franco-Indian Métis world with intimate ties to the French language and to French culture. And I don't have time to go into much detail here. I'm happy to talk a little more about it in the question and answer, but suffice it to say that by 1798, diplomatic relations between France and the United States had collapsed, and an undeclared war between France and the United States had broken out. Historians call this the quasi-war. It was largely a war that consisted of privateers attacking shipping in the Caribbean. It was in this context that Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which sharply restricted the rights of immigrants in the United States. In fact, these infamous laws were passed in response to suspicions that some of my émigrés were spying for France as they were wandering through the backcountry in the Mississippi Valley, where formerly French allied peoples lived, indigenous peoples lived, where French settlers still resided, this very contested territory. Volney himself was directly targeted by an expulsion order, and so the émigrés had to flee one more time. Talleyrand had already left in 1796. He returned to a post-terror France where he was now foreign minister. Talleyrand's time in the United States had taught him, or so he thought anyway, this was the lesson that he drew, these were the important lessons. He decided that the Franco-American alliance that had been forged during the revolution had failed to pan out. And he was determined to find a more reliable source for provisions for France's Caribbean colonies, more dependable bases for naval support in the war against Britain, which had, of course, by then resumed. The United States, he decided, was a feckless ally. The French couldn't count on them. So when Napoleon took power in France, and under the influence of Talleyrand and of the ideas that he developed while he was in the United States, France did in fact decide to try to rebuild a French empire in North America. In 1802, having secured the cession of Louisiana from Spain, Napoleon sent 80,000 troops to take Louisiana. But before arriving in Louisiana, they would stop in Saint-Domingue. They would reconquer the island. They would put the freed slaves back into slavery, and they would move from there, having resecured their most lucrative Caribbean island. They would move from there to Louisiana as the link, the hub that would protect those islands and supply them. Now, of course, it didn't work out as Napoleon had planned. Under assault by the Haitian forces and by the diseases from the tropical environment, Napoleon lost one of his finest armies. Tens of thousands of French troops died in Saint-Domingue, decimating the army that was meant to secure Louisiana. And so this was maybe the most remarkable part, unexpected part of the research for me, to learn about the extensive connections that existed between US history in this period and Haitian history and the creation of Haiti itself. It became clear that the continental expansion of the United States was intimately bound up with the birth of Haiti. As Napoleon's foreign minister, Talleyrand had a major hand in the Louisiana purchase. And actually, the transaction was financed by the very same people who collaborated with my French emigres in their American land purchases, by their friends and hosts in Philadelphia, the Binghams, with some help from Pierre César Labouchere and the Bearing Bank in London. Talleyrand most likely profited from the deal, and I'm pretty certain he must have, but you know, I never did find evidence for that, so who knows? In any event, what was clear was this brief period from 1793 to 1803 had witnessed an extraordinary transformation, and it opened up entirely new vistas for me. The research showed me that US history can't be fully understood without reference to the dramatic events taking place in Europe and the Caribbean at that time, and the deep and rich history of the indigenous world that had existed for many centuries, many millennia, and that still exists today. I learned that US history is much bigger than we tend to imagine. It runs deep into the past, and it stretches across the globe. And so there never really was a time, I think, when when US history wasn't connected to that of the rest of the world. And that seems to me a lesson worth pondering today. Thank you very much. So I think we have about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes for questions and answers. And then this is part of the fun of these evenings. Yes. Okay. So the question is about connections between the United States and Haiti, and the role of Rochambeau, who was general, of course, of the head of the commander-in-chief of the French forces in the American Revolution. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was his son who was the head of the French forces in that Napoleon's forces that tried to reconquer Haiti. It's a dismal. He died in that attempt. It's a dismal story. And it shines a very, I mean, Napoleon had many, there were many horrific events in Napoleon's career, but I think, this one is probably certainly among and maybe the most horrific. But the cruelty of that enterprise is, I go into it, and to me, I write about it as, it's a little hallucinatory almost. The viciousness, the cruelty, that was part of the French attempt to reconquer Haiti, to take these formerly enslaved people who had secured their freedom and who were willing to make every sacrifice to defend it. Rochambeau died. He died of yellow fever, I think, and he was replaced, and the war descended into real madness, and it cost about 80,000 French soldiers' lives and untold numbers of former slaves. But it was, as I sort of mentioned, I mean, this is, I don't know. So I used to live in Montreal when I was working on this book. It was in Montreal. There's a huge Haitian community in Montreal. I don't think there's a very big one here in Philadelphia. There are other big ones in Miami, in Brooklyn. Montreal has a big one, and if you talk to Haitian people, they know this. I mean, and they're speaking of Philadelphians who take pride in their history. I mean, Haitians take great pride in their history. Not everyone, of course, but many. And it's they'll tell you the United States Louisiana Purchase, it only happened because of the success of the slaves. I don't think almost any American really knows this. Very few anyway. And so these connections are really connected. And I ponder briefly in the book. I sort of think about what would have happened Toussaint at the time, Toussaint Louverture was proclaiming his loyalty to Napoleon, to his loyalty to France. Now, what would have happened if Napoleon had acknowledged that and said, you will have autonomy as part of the French Empire, and autonomy to govern yourselves? What would have happened if Napoleon had accepted that? He couldn't, for all kinds of reasons we can psychoanalyze. But what if he had? He could have secured a multiracial force in Louisiana. You can imagine. I mean, these are soldiers who, as I said, beat the three most powerful armies in the powerful navies in the world at the time. And so imagine an alliance between Toussaint and Napoleon sent to secure the Mississippi Valley. I mean, of course, you never know what would have happened, but you can imagine all kinds of different scenarios had something like this happen. So yeah, so this connection between U.S. history and Haitian history continues, and it's anything but a glorious story for the United States as well, long after.
Could you say a little more about the connection between the Haitian and his acquiescence in selling Louisiana project? That is, obviously there was a connection there. What else was there? What else did Napoleon?
Well, so Napoleon. So the strategic goals for Napoleon, were to maintain these lucrative Caribbean colonies. The idea that they had was that they could turn back the clock, that they could restore slavery in Haiti, restore this unbelievably profitable production of sugar and coffee, and restore that to its previous wealth that it provided for France. Because they thought the original aims for France in allying with the United States and were to help protect these Caribbean colonies, the French Caribbean colonies, because they thought. Because they had concluded at the time that the United States couldn't be relied on to be a firm ally. If you remember, I mean, I didn't talk about it tonight, but the United States had proclaimed its neutrality in the war between France and Britain. This was a tremendous betrayal. I mean, in fact, it was a renunciation of the terms of the alliance, the treaty that had been established during the Revolution. So this was a tremendous betrayal of the French cause, of the French alliance, and France wanted a foothold in North America to protect its Caribbean colonies, to supply the Caribbean colonies with food, for bases. As I say, warfare in the Caribbean was naval warfare, and if a ship was damaged, it's a big effort. You can't bring it back all the way there aren't any shipyards in the Caribbean, so you can try to bring it back somehow to Europe, or you lose it. But being able to restore the ship, to repair the ship in a North American port gives you a huge advantage. And this was one of the reasons that Britain had been so successful in the 7 Years' War. They had trounced France and the French Caribbean in the 7 Years' War, thanks in large part to the support of North America and the assistance it could provide to the Caribbean. So France, having failed to achieve that with its alliance with the United States, Napoleon thought, I'll retake Louisiana, and I will get all these objectives. I will have supplies for Saint-Domingue and for the other Caribbean colonies, Guadeloupe, Martinique, etc. I'll have supplies. I'll have bases for naval support, and so on. But the two went hand in hand. When Napoleon lost Saint-Domingue, the value of Louisiana was largely dissipated. And in any case, he lost the army that would have taken Louisiana. So at that point, it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to hold Louisiana. And that was when the United States entered into these negotiations. And for those of you who know, that the United States never intended. I mean, Jefferson, when he sent Livingston over, he never intended to secure all of Louisiana. The Mississippi Valley, all the Mississippi to the Rocky. He wanted New Orleans. And when Livingston arrived, the French proposed to sell all of Louisiana. And Livingston had he had to disobey his orders. He had no instructions about what to do in this case, but they realized this was an opportunity. And from Napoleon's perspective, this was a way. He wasn't going to be able to secure Louisiana. Might as well give it to the Americans and get some money out of this. What he didn't want to see was it falling into the hands of the British. One of the interesting things that I learned about this, the financing of the Louisiana Purchase, is such an interesting story because the United States didn't have the $15 million they needed to buy this land, so they borrowed that money largely from the Barings, from this British bank, and Britain was was happy to finance this purchase, even though it meant money going into French hands and fight Britain, to fund their war against Britain. But Britain was okay. The British government at the time allowed this because they didn't want to see Louisiana be French. So each of them was happy to see Louisiana. Both Britain and France were happy to see Louisiana become part of the United States. But so this all emerges really out of the conquest. Yes, in the back there are two questions. Was who Bonaparte? Joseph. So
Second wave.
if I remember correctly, as I said, it's been 10 years now, and I do mention this at the end of the book, actually. Joseph Bonaparte came here later. I think it was in the 1815. It was yes, and he came and he actually bought, I think that he bought the Fairmount Park building as his country house. Is that right? In Morristown. Okay. So, but anyway, he came later. I think I mentioned him a little bit in the coda of the book and the sort of last complete end part of the book. But it was a separate. It was always hard to figure out exactly how to. This couldn't be a book about all Franco-American migrations or or even emigres, right? There are other figures who could have figured, who could have become part of this, like Dupont Nemours, the DuPont family, they came, of course, in Delaware, but they were in Philadelphia for a time, and there were other people. Louis Philippe came, but slightly didn't quite fit with this model. I decided to focus on these figures because they all shared a kind of history. They all shared this story, this attempt to make France into a constitutional monarchy, at which failed, and so they came here. And the other figures kind of don't fit in that political story. It's worth writing about them, but I just one has to kind of draw the line somewhere, and so that was how I did that. There was another question back here.
Networks and channels, because like also involved in integration. So did you notice some kind of inertia in the sense that there were news and networks, even with the political background, the reasons for the base different, or was that like a different law?
Yeah, that's not a question I'm going to be able to answer, I'm afraid. It's a very interesting question. How much of these connections, these financial relationships and other kinds of relations, how much do they influence later waves of immigration? How much would they have been able to build on those kinds of partnerships that were established earlier? It's not something that I ever looked into, so I would hesitate to speculate about that. That'll be a book that you can write. Good question. So let's see. Liancourt went back and survived and reestablished he became a senator, I think. Volney also went back and had a distinguished career. As I mentioned, the most famous part of his career came later. And Talleyrand, of course, went back and had a successful, I think one can call, career. Noailles is the exception. Moreau went back. He had a book. I didn't talk too much about Moreau tonight. He had a bookstore, just a few blocks away from here, and he went back, and these connections shaped his future trajectory. His friendship with Talleyrand got him appointed as a forget the exact title, but when Napoleon's armies conquered Italy, he was appointed something of can't remember now. So there's these three allied towns, Padua, in northern Italy, and he was the resident, duke or whatever they would have called it, whatever the title was there. And he was very unsuccessful apparently, but he continued bringing his chests of notes and documents, and he did publish, continue to publish a lot. And Noailles never made it back. Noailles was an interesting figure to me. He had lost the most in terms of his family. His wife had been killed. His parents had been killed. They'd been executed. And he seems to have come. All the others never understood themselves as, I call them refugees or emigres, but they never understood themselves as permanently relocating to the United States or permanently moving here. They all intended to go back. They never gave up, even as the French regime kept changing, and even as they were first suspected of being spies, and then later suspected of being traitors against France, against the French Republic, and later suspected of being spies for France, they never stopped thinking of themselves as committed to France, as French, and as intending to go back. Noailles, from what I could tell, from what I could gather from his correspondence, didn't intend to go back. He intended to make a permanent stay of it here, and he became very involved with the Bingham family. He was referred to. I never did quite understand the correspondence. He was referred to as a partner in the Bingham merchant house, and other people speculated that he was having an affair with Anne Bingham, famously beautiful Anne Bingham. These are things that one can't really know. But Noailles ended up rejoining. I mean, we talked about Rochambeau and the attempt to reconquer Haiti. He ended up reallying rejoining the French forces, and he sailed down to the Caribbean to try to as part of that effort to reconquer Haiti, to put the freed slaves, freed people back into slavery, and so he also had a sad end, and it was not a glorious end to his. He died in a off the coast of Cuba in that effort.
My actual question is, what is Stephen Gerrard doing? It says the French Philadelphia, that I really still has a big footprint.
Yes. So Stephen Gerrard, he's an interesting. So he doesn't fit into this trajectory. He came earlier. He came during the Revolution or immediately after the Revolution. I can't remember exactly when. Sorry? I knew that somebody in this room would. So he came in 1776 during the American Revolution, and he stayed put. And he became fabulously wealthy, but I think he wasn't a merchant, a successful merchant. He didn't have the wealth that he would later come to have. And his politics, if I'm remembering right now, it's been, as I say, it's been a little while, but his politics were quite different from the politics of these figures. He was committed to Republican politics, I believe. Isn't that right? He was a Jeffersonian. These figures really kind of orbit. I mean, they had friendships with Jefferson, and they shared a kind of, I think, liberal ethos with Jefferson, but they orbited much more in Federalist political circles. And that's why they were distrusted, actually, by Volney is the exception. But that's why they were distrusted by a lot of Republican politicians, because they thought that they were, this was a period of bitter partisan warfare in the 1790s. And the Jeffersonians, the Republicans, thought that the Federalists were trying to restore a monarchy here. So from their perspective, we can call that paranoid. I mean, it depends on how we want to see it. But from their perspective, these French figures were quite suspicious. They appeared quite suspicious. And Gerrard was not part of that circle. He came from a very different background. He didn't have that elite background. And his politics were different. And as far as I know, they didn't have any connection although there may be something that I forgot.
French were very active in cultural landscape every day. As restaurants and French culture. What was the reaction?
Well, okay, so this, I sort of alluded to this. I mean, it's an interesting story. So the puritanical, you use that term is that's much more of a kind of New England, sort of political culture, and the people in New England had long history of fighting French-speaking people and French people in New England, between New England and New France. Philadelphia's political culture was, I think, quite different. There were many more theaters. Theaters, even when it was outlawed in Boston, they had theaters here, and so there was more of a tilt. I think more openness. There was a huge amount of trade, as I've mentioned on several occasions, between Philadelphia and the French Caribbean. So there was a lot of cultural exchanges already. And as I said, this was really the period when these elite figures in Philadelphia wanted to understand themselves as informed by French culture. I mean, later to be elite in the United States meant, I don't know, having connections with London or having a kind of British, maybe marrying into the British aristocracy, so like if you're a wealthy Philadelphia industrialist or something like that in the 1860s or 70s, maybe that's your objective, right? Get a British title. In this period, it's France, and France is what they all look to, and this isn't just the United States. I mean, this is in the wake of Louis XIV and the great French century, and French manners, French language was all across Europe. The elite and the aristocracy across Europe, they spoke French. They French fashion dictated what they would wear. So this was in this, as I mentioned, this kind of brief period. I think it opened with the Revolutionary Alliance, let's say in the 1700s, and it closed with this sort of military diplomatic fallout in the late 1790s. But in this period, it really is these elite figures are looking to France, and not just these elite figures, actually in a very different register. The artisans and workers, they're looking to the French Republic as as their model, and they feel committed to the cause of French republicanism. So on both sides of the political spectrum, the Federalists or the Republicans, these elite merchants, the artisan workers north of Market, everybody is looking towards France for different reasons, but they all feel themselves connected to this French world. We are, I think we're out of time. I think that's what that means. So thank you very much. It's always fun to. My most pleasant year in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you. If you want, we have copies of the book, which are no longer available in the stores. Head House normally sells books for us, but they could not get them from the publisher. We have the books here. Francois will sign them. You want to learn more about this story, get yourself a copy of the book. Someone you love or care about who needs something else by their bedside table, get them a copy also. We're selling them right over here. We thank you all for coming. If you've enjoyed tonight's program, next Friday night is one of our First Fridays. We have a First Friday most every First Friday. Our Drexel intern, Majine Babcock, who is a photography student and is working with us this semester, is going to be about carte de visite and French Philadelphia history through photography. Should be a lot of fun. So come 5 to 7 on next Friday night, not this Friday, next Friday, First Friday in March. Come for a free and fun event at the Athenaeum. So we hope to see you all again. Come buy a book or 2 or 3 here at this table in front. Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Susan, for bringing a wonderful program tonight.